Ma'am, we have a warrant. Don't touch anything.
I work in cybersecurity. I catch people like this.
Not today.
This is Dorothy Bates, Senior Cybersecurity Lead at one of the most valuable companies on Earth. A woman whose entire job was to protect the institution from exactly the kind of threat she had quietly become. She spent her days hunting for weak spots in the system. She knew every alarm, every tripwire, every gap. And for 18 months, she used every single one of them against the company that trusted her most. Her colleagues saw someone who stayed late, flagged problems no one else caught, and earned the confidence of executives who barely knew her name. What federal investigators saw was something else entirely. 4,100 fraudulent transactions, 11 fake companies, and $4.1 million moved through the system she was hired to protect. Hidden in plain sight, inside the very rules she helped write. By the time this footage ends, Dorothy Bates will have lost the career, the lifestyle, the cover story, and the one thing she built her entire scheme on. The belief that she was the smartest person in the room. Apple handles millions of vendor payments every single quarter across a network that stretches across dozens of countries. Their systems check thousands of contracts in real time. Their cybersecurity team, Dorothy's team, is made up of some of the most qualified people in the business, hired for one reason: to make sure nobody beats the system from the inside. But three numbers explain exactly how this happened. $400 billion in yearly revenue, which means a few $1 million barely shows up as a rounding error. Over 100,000 employees worldwide, creating a structure so large a person can simply disappear inside it. And thousands of approved vendors moving through the payment pipeline at any given moment, most of them never looked at twice. The system was built for speed. It was built for scale. It was not built for suspicion. And it ran on one core belief: that the people trusted to see where the system was blind were there to fix those gaps, not exploit them. It never accounted for someone who had spent years learning exactly where it couldn't see. Before we go any further, if you enjoy true crime cases like this one, hit subscribe right now. Every week, we cover real stories, real footage, and real people who thought they had found the perfect system. Dorothy Bates thought the same thing. Dorothy Bates grew up in Columbus, Ohio, not the wealthy part, and not the poorest part either. Just the middle. The kind of neighborhood where people went to work every day, paid their bills on time, and didn't ask for much more than that. Her father dispatched freight trucks for a regional logistics company. Her mother processed insurance claims at a mid-sized hospital. Neither job sounds like much at a dinner party. But both jobs required something that most people quietly underestimate: the ability to understand how a system works from the inside out. Routing schedules, billing codes, claim numbers, approval chains. Her parents lived inside those details every single day. And Dorothy watched. She absorbed the way her father could look at a delivery map and immediately spot the inefficiency nobody else had noticed. She absorbed the way her mother could read an insurance form and know, before anyone told her, exactly where it was going to get rejected and why. Other kids collected hobbies. Dorothy collected patterns. By the time she reached high school, she had built a quiet reputation. Not as the smartest student in the room, though she often was, but as the one who understood how things were put together. Classmates came to her not for the answer to a question, but for the explanation underneath it. Why does this work this way? What happens if this step gets skipped? Dorothy always knew. Teachers noted that she had an unusual relationship with rules. She never broke them. She never fought them. She simply learned them well enough to know exactly what they would and wouldn't catch. That is a very specific kind of intelligence, and it is extraordinarily useful in the right hands. She went on to study information systems at a state university, adding a minor in organizational behavior. It was a combination that made perfect sense for someone wired the way she was. Information systems taught her how institutions store and move data. Organizational behavior taught her how institutions store and move trust. Together, they gave her a complete picture of how large organizations actually function, not how they say they function, but how they really work when no one is paying close attention. She graduated with strong grades and clean references and walked into the professional world with a skill set that, in honest hands, builds careers in compliance, security, and corporate risk management. She was learning, without knowing she was learning, exactly what it would take to make a $4.1 million problem completely invisible inside a $400 billion company. She just didn't know that yet. Dorothy's career before Apple was exactly the kind of record that makes hiring managers relax. No gaps, no complaints, no red flags of any kind. Just a steady, quiet climb through jobs that most people would consider unglamorous but important. She spent 3 years at a regional bank working on IT security. She learned how financial institutions protect their data, where their weak points tend to be, and, just as importantly, how they decide what is worth checking and what gets waved through. After that, she moved to a mid-sized consulting firm where her job was to audit vendor contracts for large corporate clients. She reviewed how companies paid outside businesses, where the approval process slowed down, and where corners quietly got cut. She was good at it. Her reviews said so every single time. Then came Apple. She came in as a contract analyst, one of hundreds cycling through the company's vast network of temporary and project-based staff. But Dorothy was not the type to stay temporary for long. Within a year, she was converted to a full-time role. Within 18 months of that, she was promoted. The promotion was the moment everything changed. Her new title was Senior Cybersecurity Lead with Procurement Audit Access. On paper, it sounds like a technical role with a long name. In practice, it was something far more significant. The position placed her inside 2 separate systems at the same time: Apple's security review process and its vendor payment pipeline. Most employees lived in one world or the other. Dorothy now had a foot in both. Her performance review from that period left very little to the imagination. Dorothy demonstrates an exceptional ability to identify structural gaps in high-volume processing environments. She sees what others overlook. They meant it as a compliment. They were not wrong. What that promotion actually gave her was a combination of powers that almost never exist in a single pair of hands inside a company Apple's size. She could approve new vendors. She could review flagged transactions. She could open an investigation, and she could close one. On the same account. Sometimes on the same day. Think about what that means. The person responsible for catching fraud was also the person responsible for deciding when the search for fraud was over. She had spent years learning how large systems decide what to look at and what to ignore. She had spent years learning where the gaps were. And now, for the first time, she had been handed the authority to stand directly inside those gaps, with a badge, a title, and the full trust of the institution behind her. She now had the key, and she understood, with perfect clarity, exactly what it unlocked. To understand what Dorothy built, you first need to understand how Apple moves money to its outside vendors, because the scheme she designed was built directly around that process, step by step. When an approved vendor does work for Apple, they send an invoice. That invoice enters the procurement system, where it gets matched against an existing contract. If the numbers line up and the invoice falls below a certain dollar amount, the system processes the payment automatically. No second set of eyes. No phone call. No human being double-checking anything. The payment simply goes through. That automatic threshold exists for a good reason. Apple processes an enormous number of vendor payments every single quarter. If a real person had to manually review every single invoice, the resulting backlog would cost the company far more time and money than the occasional fraudulent payment ever could. The system was designed to be efficient. And efficiency, by its very nature, requires trust. Dorothy knew exactly where that trust ended and the scrutiny began. She knew the threshold down to the dollar. She knew it because she had helped set it. What she built on top of that knowledge worked in 3 distinct layers, each one designed to support the next. The first layer was the foundation. She created 11 shell companies, fake businesses registered across Delaware, Nevada, and 2 international locations. She chose the names carefully. They sounded like real technology subcontractors. Professional. Forgettable. The kind of vendor name that shows up in a long list and doesn't make anyone stop scrolling. The second layer was the engine. From these fake companies, she submitted invoices to Apple for cybersecurity consulting work that was never actually done. The services described were vague enough to match Apple's existing vendor categories without raising questions. And every single invoice was priced just below the automatic review threshold. Not once did she go over. Not by accident, and not by coincidence. The third layer was the lock on the door. Because her role included reviewing flagged transactions, Dorothy was frequently the first person the system notified when something looked unusual. She was also the person with the authority to decide that it wasn't unusual after all, and close the flag entirely. The first fraudulent invoice was for $48,500, described as penetration testing consultation. It entered the system, matched a vendor category, was processed automatically, triggered a routine flag, was reviewed by Dorothy Bates, and was closed by Dorothy Bates. Start to finish, for business days. Clean. Invisible. Perfect. She did it 4,099 more times. By the 6th month, Dorothy had decided she couldn't run everything alone. The first person she brought in was a former colleague, someone she had worked with years earlier, now sitting in an accounts payable role at a separate Apple vendor. This person's job gave Dorothy something useful, an inside view of how vendor payments were being processed from the outside. The second person was her brother-in-law, who became the registered agent for 3 of the 11 shell companies. His name was on the paperwork. His address was on the filings. He handled what needed to be handled without ever being told the full picture. That last part was intentional. Dorothy kept both of them in the dark about the true size of what she was running. They each knew their piece. Neither knew the whole. That way, if either one of them ever became a problem, they couldn't tell anyone anything that mattered. The money, meanwhile, was moving, and the life it was buying was becoming impossible to miss. Dorothy purchased a home in a quiet suburb of San Jose for $340,000. She paid cash for a $94,000 Mercedes-Benz GLE. She took 4 international trips inside 18 months, including 2 weeks at a private villa in Tuscany. The kind of trip people post pictures of and never quite stop talking about. And here is the part that made all of it work. Nobody at Apple thought twice about any of it. Apple pays its senior staff extremely well. A cybersecurity lead with Dorothy's title and tenure earning enough to buy a nice house and drive a luxury car was not a story that made anyone suspicious. It was a story that made people nod and say she had finally made it. She never told that story herself. She simply let people tell it for her. That is a much harder thing to prove and a much safer way to lie. At the height of the operation, Dorothy was running invoices through multiple shell accounts at the same time, sometimes 3 separate fraudulent submissions in a single week. She tracked every threshold, every account, and every payment cycle on encrypted spreadsheets stored on a personal device that never touched Apple's network. She was not panicking. She was not improvising. She was managing. There is a difference between being reckless and being confident, and Dorothy Bates was never reckless. She was completely, entirely confident in the system, in her position, and in her own ability to stay one step ahead of anyone who might come looking. That confidence would cost her everything. If you're wondering how something this large stayed hidden for so long, stay with us through the next section, because the answer isn't that Apple wasn't watching. It's that Dorothy was the one doing the watching. Like and subscribe if you want more cases like this one. The thing that brought Dorothy Bates down had nothing to do with Apple. No internal alarm. No suspicious colleague. No whistleblower. The system she had spent 18 months navigating with such precision never caught her at all. What caught her was something far more ordinary, a routine sweep by the IRS. Every year, the IRS runs cross-referencing audits on small business tax filings, looking for a specific pattern. Companies that report little to no actual business income but show significant movement in their bank accounts. It is a standard process. Thousands of entities get flagged and cleared every cycle. But one of Dorothy's 11 shell companies surfaced during one of those sweeps, and when the auditors looked closer, something didn't sit right. The paperwork looked clean. The bank activity did not. The IRS referred the case to the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit. Within 6 weeks, forensic accountants had traced 3 of the 11 shell companies directly back to invoices inside Apple's procurement system. At that point, the FBI brought Apple's legal and security teams into the investigation, quietly, under a strict confidentiality agreement. No announcements. No internal alerts. No changes to any process that Dorothy might notice. For the next 4 months, investigators built the complete picture while Dorothy continued coming to work. She sat at her desk. She reviewed flags. She closed investigations. She had no idea that the people now watching her were far more patient than she had ever given anyone credit for being. The piece of evidence that confirmed everything was not found through a tip or a mistake Dorothy made in real time. It was found during a covert review of her corporate device backup, a process she almost certainly believed was never going to happen. Stored on an encrypted personal drive was a spreadsheet. color-coded, meticulously organized. It listed every fraudulent invoice she had ever submitted, every shell company she had used, every payment that had gone through, and the name of the Apple compliance reviewer who had signed off on each flagged transaction. Nearly every entry in that final column said the same thing. Reviewed and closed DB. Her own initials. On every single line. She had kept a perfect record of her own crime. 2 weeks before her arrest, Dorothy resigned from Apple. She cited personal health reasons. She cleared her desk, said her goodbyes, and walked out of the building believing she had timed her exit perfectly. Investigators noted, without any apparent surprise, that she continued running 2 of the shell accounts after her resignation date. She did not know they were already inside everything she had built. She thought she had walked out clean. She had not walked out at all. It was a Tuesday morning, 7:42 a.m. Dorothy Bates had already been out. She had driven to a coffee shop, picked up her order, and was walking back across her own driveway when the 4 agents stepped into view. Plain clothes. No marked vehicles. Badges out and open before she had taken another step. She was still holding her coffee bags. Her keys were in her other hand. Dorothy Bates? FBI. We have a federal warrant for your arrest. Please put the bags down and keep your hands where we can see them. She didn't put the bags down right away. For a moment she just stood there, and when she finally spoke, the words came out in pieces. What is this? I left Apple. I'm not even there anymore. You have the wrong person. Ma'am. Hands. The bags went down. The keys stayed in her fist for just a second longer than they should have. And then she let those go too. What happened in the next 40 seconds was something the arresting agents would later describe in their reports with careful, precise language. Her composure held. She asked for her attorney. She did not scream, did not cry, did not try to run. Her face moved through several expressions in quick succession. Confusion first, then something that looked like rapid calculation, and then a kind of stillness that sat somewhere between acceptance and exhaustion. It was the calculation the agents noted most. Not the confusion, not the fear. The brief, quiet moment where her eyes went somewhere private and she appeared to be running numbers one final time. It was the look of someone who had always known, on some level, that this specific moment was a possibility, and was now simply confirming that it had arrived. She was walked to a federal vehicle in the same clothes she had worn to pick up coffee. Casual. Ordinary. The kind of outfit that makes the moment feel even more abrupt than it already is. Behind her, in the driveway she was leaving for the last time as a free woman, agents began the process of seizing the Mercedes. The search of the house took 6 hours. When the agents left, they carried out 7 hard drives, 2 laptops, and a collection of financial documents that covered the entire 18-month span of the operation from beginning to end. Her phone was taken as evidence along with everything else. The photos from the Tuscany villa were still on it. The private pool. The hillside view. The table set for dinner on a warm evening somewhere far from a San Jose driveway, and 4 federal badges. A life that was now, in every way that mattered, completely over. When the charges were filed, they came in at 11 counts. Wire fraud, money laundering, aggravated identity theft, obstruction of an internal investigation. It was a list that laid out, in plain legal language, everything Dorothy Bates had spent 18 months carefully hiding. She pleaded guilty to 7 of those counts as part of a negotiated agreement. There was no dramatic trial. No moment where she sat across from a jury and tried to explain herself. She had kept records precise enough to make a defense nearly impossible, and she knew it. The same spreadsheet that she had built to manage her scheme had made sure of that. At sentencing, the federal judge could have talked about the money. $4.1 million is not a small number, and the court had every reason to center the entire proceeding around it. But she didn't. She focused on something else entirely. You were trusted not merely with access, but with the responsibility to protect the very system you exploited. The harm here is not only financial, it is institutional. Every vendor who now faces heightened scrutiny, every employee who built that trust over years, paid a price for what you chose to do with yours. Dorothy Bates was sentenced to 9 years in federal prison, with no possibility of early release before the mandatory minimum was served. She was ordered to pay back the full $4.1 million in restitution. The San Jose home was forfeited. The Mercedes was forfeited. Every dollar recovered from the shell accounts was seized. totaling approximately $3.2 million in assets stripped away in a single court order. Her brother-in-law, whose name had been on the paperwork for 3 of the shell companies, pleaded guilty to 1 count of conspiracy. He received 18 months. The accounts payable contact received 3 years. Apple made changes quietly and quickly. Within the following quarter, the company restructured its vendor approval process, separating the authority to flag anomalies from the authority to approve vendors. 2 functions that had lived inside Dorothy's job description at the same time and would never do so again. The human cost landed somewhere the headlines didn't reach. A 67-year-old man who had run a legitimate cybersecurity subcontracting firm for over a decade, one of the vendors caught inside the audit freeze during the investigation, issued a public statement saying the payment delays had cost his company $280,000 and forced him to let 4 employees go. He never fully recovered the Apple account. Dorothy Bates was the smartest person in the room right up until the moment the room quietly filled with people who had been watching her for months. She had studied every blind spot in the system with extraordinary care. She forgot to account for the ones in herself.